Hi, APUS history students. I want to review with you for Unit 6 about politics and government as a major theme. Remember that Unit 6 really starts in the post Civil War Reconstruction time period and goes all the way to the beginning of the 20th century. So we're really talking the last quarter of the 19th century. And there's a lot of change that's happening. Let's focus in right now on that political change. And I'm basing my review on this particular timeline right here, which you should find on your Google Classroom. But I'm going to be going through this timeline via a Google slideshow. So let's get started with that. In terms of government review for these last 25 years or so, we are talking about these major issues: Gilded Age politics, the political machine at a local level in urban areas, in rural areas, the role of the Grange and populism, in the South, segregation and the establishment of Jim Crow segregation laws, and overall ending, since that's a pretty negative point, trying to end on a more positive point, what government reform comes about through the Pendleton Act and the ICC. Let's start off with the Gilded Age. Gilded Age, remember, is a term that Mark Twain actually coined to reference this entire time period, this end of the 19th century, that we somehow or other, because of major wealthy people like Andrew Carnegie, seem really shiny and beautiful on the outside, but at our core, we really see that there is immense poverty within the United States. And the people that tended to rule politically were heavily influenced by that rich upper class group of people. We see that in the late 19th century, presidential power is pretty weak in comparison to what we see in terms of the powers that presidents have today and are growing in power over the 20th century. We're not there in the last quarter of the 19th century. We also see really the rise of third parties during this time period, and there's intense really competition between the Democrats and the Republicans, which allows for this rise of third parties, the most famous being the Populist Party. We also see local and state governments exerting a lot of control and power, and the best examples of this would be through city machine politics like Tammany Hall in New York, and also the firm establishment of a segregated South through Jim Crow. And we also see really the two major issues in politics during this time period on the national level are going to be money issues and civil service reform. Talking about money issues on the whole nationwide level, we have a real divide in politics during this time period concerning who supported the amount of money in circulation. If you were a wealthy person, and most of these people are located in the northeastern part of the United States, these are the business interest people, the people that own banks, own large businesses. They would be what would be considered a gold bug. And you can see in this photograph here, we have a pin that someone might have worn if they were in support of the gold bugs. This is a photograph of William McKinley. He's going to be the person who was elected in 1896 and then reelected in 1900. He's a Republican. Republican interests tended to, at this point in time, really represent the upper class people, the people who owned the banks, who ran the businesses. And they were considered gold bugs because they only wanted gold in circulation or gold backing up the currency that was used on a national level. That would have really put a lot of constraints on the money in circulation and would have really strengthened the dollar, which would have supported their business interests. If you were more middle class or working class, you would have wanted more money in circulation. You would have wanted free silver or more coinage of gold. You might even want greenbacks. Greenbacks being paper money. And a lot of people at this time viewed greenbacks as somehow being fake in comparison to actually having a gold standard or having some sort of silver standard. So Frank Baum wrote a series of books, the most famous being The Wizard of Oz. Is The Wizard of Oz a reference to this monetary debate? Remember, Dorothy is traveling on the yellow brick road of gold. Her slippers in the book are actually silver slippers, but where is she headed? She's headed to the land of Oz, which is a green emerald city. And Oz might be a reference to ounce, the reference ounce. Just an interesting way to try to remember that monetary focus. Another thing having to do with money is how much influence big business at this point in time in the Gilded Age really had control over government. And in this most famous cartoon of the time period, The Bosses of the Senate, we see these moneyed interest people really kind of owning the Senate, overlooking what the Senate was doing and really trying to influence legislation that would benefit their moneyed interest. These are all representative of monopolies. Remember, they're money bags. And the names of these monopolies are written on their money bags. Look at how large the entrance to the Senate is for them, but the entrance to the public is closed off. And the senators are paying attention to what these monopolies are demanding. Let's get to some local politics during this time period. In urban areas, especially in New York, where the famous Tammany Hall is running and is the best example of this, we see examples of the political machine. The political machine meant it was a group of people who really dominated local politics and control of the local government. They used the immigrant vote to stay in power, and they often lined their own pockets with money that they made off of building new parts needed in cities, things like firehouses or sewage systems or water treatment plants, making sure that their friends got the job in order to make sure that they got a portion of the profits to build these new things. Thomas Nast is probably the most famous cartoonist to document his dismay over this use of Tammany Hall and dominating the politics of New York. And so here's one of his most famous cartoons of Boss Tweed, the person who's in charge of Tammany Hall. And you can see his view of what Boss Tweed really is. Here's another one where Thomas Nast shows William Marcy Tweed, who is again, Boss Tweed putting his thumb down on New York and controlling over much of New York and even extending out to New Jersey in what's being built at the time, things like public schools or, again, water treatment systems or other public utilities, and making money off of that and controlling the vote that's there. That's an example of the political machine. I had mentioned third parties earlier on, the most famous being the Populist Party. It's coming out of organizations like the National Grange, the Grange being a kind of union of agricultural workers. And those Granges develop on a local level, but they emerge and help to lead to the Populist Party, which is on the national level. James Weaver is the first populist to ever run for president in 1892. And he ran on what's called the Omaha Platform. What did it call for? More government regulation to help the working class people, most notably agricultural workers, but also people who might be working in factories too. What are some of the things that they wanted? And this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some of the major things. They want government regulation of railroads, telegraph and telephone lines, and electricity to keep prices down and to keep prices fair and consistent. They want more of a voice in government through direct election of senators. They want an 8-hour enforceable working day. They want a graduated income tax to make sure everyone is paying in a way that meets what their actual income is. They all had ideas to really help the working class. In 1896, the person that they nominate to run for president is William Jennings Bryan. He gives a really famous political speech known as the Cross of Gold speech. Just if you guys remember this political cartoon, it has to do with the populace. Here's James Weaver here with this amazingly long beard. This is a criticism of the Populist Party. It's called the Platform of Lunacy. And you see all this patchwork of ideas that are being put forth in forming the Populist Party and the different groups that are helping to form the Populist Party. Getting back to William Jennings Bryan and his Cross of Gold speech, in his Cross of Gold speech, he talked about the moneyed interests, the business interests, not he claims that they were trying to crucify all of mankind on a cross of gold, meaning the gold standard, and also that they were trying to press down on the brow of labor a crown of thorns, using a lot of Christian imagery here to really propose the idea that the moneyed interests were making their money off the backs of the working classes by keeping to this gold standard, and they needed to support putting more money in circulation to help get more money flowing to help the middle class and the working class people. One other major aspect of government that's happening throughout the South in Unit 6 in this Gilded Age, end of the 19th century time period, is we see states in the South passing Jim Crow laws. These are formal, codified laws that really establish racial segregation, and they're going to be in power for almost a complete century, starting really in the 1870s and really coming into play in the 1890s. They're going to be in place until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. They're going to impact all aspects of daily life, and most definitely all aspects of daily life in public places. Everything from schools, parks, restrooms, buses, trains, restaurants, theaters, hospitals, and more. What they're doing is really trying to separate the African American population from the Caucasian population. And here's a photograph, from the 20th century, not from Unit 6, but really seeing that long-lasting legacy of these Jim Crow laws that are set up through state governments. Plessy versus Ferguson is a national Supreme Court case that upheld Jim Crow laws, and it establishes the notion of separate but equal. That comes about in 1896, and it's coming actually out of a test case where Homer Plessy, who was from New Orleans, from a very mixed community in New Orleans, really tries to test the Louisiana segregation laws and pushes against them, similar to the way that Rosa Parks pushes against the segregation law in the 1960s of segregation on buses. But Homer Plessy is not successful in suing for his rights to be able to ride the trains as a person who is only 1/8 of African descent and 7/8 white descent. He cannot ride on a white train in Louisiana. Ending on a more positive note, we're going to see that also during this time period, there is some effort at trying to create some sort of government reform. And the most famous examples of government reform are going to be the Pendleton Act and the ICC. The Pendleton Act is in response to James Garfield being assassinated. The person who assassinated him was not given a government job that he thought that he deserved because he was supportive of James Garfield's party. And as a result, Congress acted in creating the Pendleton Act, which makes it so that certain government jobs on the federal level cannot be based solely on the spoils system, that you actually have to have an education and in many cases pass tests to be able to hold these federal jobs. You need to also remember, tying into government, social Darwinism. Social Darwinism doesn't lead to reform, but it is the prevailing view in this time period, and it's one of the major reasons why there is so little government regulation of business in this time period. Last, the major piece of government reform besides the Pendleton Act is the ICC, which is the Interstate Commerce Commission. What it really does is it regulates the railroads, and it focuses in on the idea that any service, this is directly taken from the law, any charges to be made for any service in transportation of passengers or property, they have to be reasonable and just. And railroads cannot just change rates to maximize their profits. Okay, that's where I'm ending for here, and I will see you in other reviews. Have a great day, APUSers.